later, with some lingering outbreaks, particularly for England and Wales. And that's how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, you're watching GB News. Coming up on the Political Correction, we're discussing what turned out to be a controversial week in Westminster, as well as the High Court's decision this week that the government acted unlawfully in their handling of care homes at the start of the pandemic. That plus plenty more after the latest news.
Good morning, it's 10 o'clock. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB Newsroom. Commons Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle is calling for radical reform after a series of bullying and sexual misconduct offences involving MPs in Parliament. Writing in The Observer, Sir Lindsay says he wants to make the House a safe and inclusive place to work. He believes working practices need to be overhauled, including stopping MPs from directly employing their own staff. The statement comes after MP Neil Parish resigned after being caught watching pornography in the Commons. Tory party chairman Oliver Dowden says the Conservative Party will make sure its candidate list becomes more equal. He told the Sunday Telegraph it should reflect the fact that half the population are women. Around a quarter of Tory candidates at the 2019 election were women, but Labour managed more than half. Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries says ensuring a majority of women in Parliament could help tackle Westminster sleaze. Ukraine's military says 20 civilians have been evacuated from a steel plant in the besieged city of Mariupol. However, Russia's defence ministry claims the number of people who've managed to leave the steelworks is around 46. That's despite President Vladimir Putin ordering troops to contain those sheltering inside. Meanwhile, President Volodymyr Zelensky claims Russia has lost more than 23,000 soldiers so far in its invasion of the country.
All the leaders of the free world know what Russia has done to Mariupol, and there will be responsibility for this, for Russia. Many of the world leaders are trying to help save our heroic defenders of the city. This was discussed in great detail with the UN Secretary-General during his visit to Kyiv. We're doing everything to ensure that the evacuation mission from Mariupol does get carried out.
The US Speaker of the House has met with President Zelensky in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Nancy Pelosi told the Ukrainian leader that his fight is a fight for everyone. She also said the US is committed to the long haul and stands firmly with Ukraine as it battles what she called Putin's diabolic invasion.
We believe that we are visiting you to say thank you for your fight for freedom, that we are on a frontier of freedom, and that your fight is a fight for everyone. And so our commitment is to be there for you until the fight is done.
Meanwhile, the UK's ambassador to Ukraine says she feels comfortable after returning to Kyiv. Melinda Simmons says it's the right place to be after going back to the capital despite Russian threats against diplomats there. It's after Britain announced last month it would reopen the embassy in the city in a show of support to President Zelensky and his troops. Angelina Jolie's visit to Lviv in Ukraine has been interrupted as air raid sirens warned people to take shelter from a Russian attack. The Hollywood actress had been visiting displaced children at a railway station as a special envoy for the United Nations Refugee Agency. She was seen rushing out of the station and into a waiting car. Previously, she said she wants to do everything possible to ensure the protection and basic human rights of refugees in the region. The business secretary has written to North Sea oil and gas firms asking them to come up with a plan to increase domestic production. Kwasi Kwarteng says the industry must invest in homegrown energy production to boost the British economy and bring down consumer bills in the long term. He said firms must also set out plans for investment in clean energy ahead of a meeting in the coming weeks. COVID guidance in Scotland is changing from today. Those with the virus will no longer need to self-isolate, but will still be advised to stay at home. Contact tracing has also come to an end as case numbers continue to fall. The number of COVID infections has dropped for the 5th successive week, with about 1 in 25 people having the virus. The Prince of Wales has called for the nation's dwindling historic natural habitat to be renewed. It's as he unveiled a collection of 70 ancient woodlands and 70 trees dedicated to the Queen to mark her Platinum Jubilee. Prince Charles says these precious assets need to be preserved for future generations.
If we are to create the ancient trees of the future, we must plant more trees in hedgerows, in fields, churchyards and avenues.
This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now it's back to the political correction.
Good morning, you're watching GB News and this is The Political Correction. I'm Gianna Davison and today I'm joined by Arlene Foster in Northern Ireland and Paul Embry in Norfolk. We're here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. This is not about journalists talking to journalists, it's about you telling us what you think. Coming up this hour, we discuss what's been a controversial week in Parliament with reports of sexual harassment running rife and senior female MPs condemning a so-called sexist culture. Neil Parish has resigned as an MP after admitting he watched pornography twice in the House of Commons, describing it as a moment of madness. We dig deeper into the story. And we discuss the ongoing war in Ukraine after news that Britain will send thousands of troops to Eastern Europe in a show of defiance against Russian aggression. And today, on the 25th anniversary of that Labour victory, we want to know what are your most memorable moments of the Blair years. Let us know by emailing us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweeting us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction. Well, it's fair to say it's been a controversial week in Parliament, with reports of sexual harassment running rife and a flurry of stories bringing the issue of sexual misconduct to the fore. Tory MP Caroline Noakes has suggested the Conservative Party is institutionally sexist, adding that there is a culture of male entitlement and that she has been on the receiving end of misogynistic nicknames and smears. Now, I'm going to go to Paul first on this. Based on your experience, Paul, do you think there is a toxic culture in Westminster?
What I do think, Deanna, is the whole thing is turning into a little bit of a soap opera, to be honest. I think we always need to think about these situations. What is the man or the woman on the Clapham omnibus thinking about what they're seeing and reading in the news every day? Now, I think they're probably thinking, look, there's a cost of living crisis. We've got a war in Europe. My real wages are falling. I might be struggling to put food on the table. I might be struggling to pay the mortgage. And Parliament seems completely absorbed in its own affairs. Now, it may well be true that there's a toxic atmosphere in some quarters at Parliament. And obviously, serious allegations need to be investigated. If people, MPs or otherwise, are behaving in a way that's not appropriate, and if people feel they're being bullied or harassed, then it's absolutely right and proper that those allegations are addressed. But at the end of the day, MPs cannot lose sight of what they're there for. They're often accused of living in a bubble, and at the moment, I think they're proving people right, people who make that accusation towards them. So what I would call for is a bit of perspective, frankly. Yes, look at these issues and make sure they're addressed through formal channels if necessary, but do not lose sight of what matters to people out there in the country, which is the everyday stresses and strains that are impacting on their own lives at the moment.
Isn't there an argument, though, Paul, that if we do have an interesting / toxic culture in Parliament and it puts off good people from standing as MPs, then that actually does have a detrimental impact on the things that you've been talking about, because we haven't necessarily got the brightest and best in there tackling the challenges that the country needs us to tackle?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure it's ever put off any MPs prior to now. I mean, I would like to think if you're a prospective MP, then you've got a bit of a backbone in the first place. You're not some sort of snowflake who's not going to run for Parliament because you're worried that somebody might be nasty to you. So I don't see that as a problem as things stand. And I just think it's a little bit unhealthy, to be honest, for a Parliament to be so obsessed about what each other are doing. I mean, we've seen MPs recently go onto social media making allegations against fellow MPs, some of which are serious, admittedly, but some of which really, I think, are a little more than tittle-tattle. And it's just being done, frankly, to try to score political points. So, if I were an MP, I would be thinking, look, if we are going to retain respect for this institution, if we are going to maintain our relevance to people's lives, then we've got to make sure that we concentrate on talking about what matters to people out there in Britain. If we get too obsessed about what's going on within this building, we're going to lose touch with people. And that umbilical cord that connects the public to the people who govern them will be in serious danger of being severed, and that would be a real problem for democracy, I think.
Thanks, Paul. Arlene, I'm keen to come to you on this because, in your time as an elected politician, but also as First Minister, you must have experienced your fair share of some of these sort of masculine behaviours.
Well, I think all women do, but it's something we choose to do because we believe we can make a difference and we step forward, and that's the important thing to do. And if somebody is nasty or misogynistic, you call it out, you move on and you deal with it. I absolutely agree with Paul that this has become self-indulgent nonsense because whilst we're dealing with absolutely enormous issues, the mainstream media is absolutely focused on what's happening in the bars and terraces of Westminster. And frankly, I couldn't care less, because what I want to know is what the MPs are doing in relation to the war in Ukraine, and we're going to speak about that later, what we're doing to tackle the cost of living crisis, what we're going to do to deal with the energy crisis. Those are the things that matter to the people who elect MPs, not what they're doing in the bar after work. And frankly, they expect better from their MPs. Of course they do. But I had a very interesting conversation, Deanna, with Caroline Fisk on Friday on my own show. And she said, if there's bad behaviour, let's call it out. But let's not think that everybody in Parliament is engaging in this. Let's have some moral perspective, because most MPs go to Parliament, they do their job, they come back to their constituencies and they work very hard. So let's not get this out of proportion. There are some people who use the power that they're given as MPs and they abuse it. Those people should be removed, they should leave Parliament and they should go elsewhere.
Thanks, Arlene. Well, We are going to come on to some of those other topics very soon. But first, I'm delighted to say we're going to be joined by the MP for Romsey and Southampton North and also Chair of the Women and Equality Select Committee, Caroline Noakes. Caroline, thank you for coming on our show this morning. What have your reflections been in how kind of the situation in Parliament has or hasn't changed since you became an MP versus now?
Well, I think we've had some interesting points this morning. I would reflect that since 2010, and it's 12 years now that I've been an MP, the behaviours have improved. We have got better at calling them out, and critically, there are more women in Parliament, and that makes a real difference to the culture of the place, and that's what I want to see more of. So I'm really pleased this morning that Oliver Dowden is saying we're going to see more female candidates, hopefully more female MPs after the next election, because actually that does help to detoxify some of the cultures that have been really unpleasant.
Mm. Well, you've been very kind of vocal in sharing some of your experiences, and some of it's quite harrowing. Some of the things that you shared on the Chopper podcast earlier this week, inappropriate touching, staring, bullying, people trying to trash your reputation. It's hard, isn't it?
It is tough, but I think we've also heard this morning, look, the people that step up and become MPs are tough. We have a backbone. We have plenty of resilience. My message is put in place some proper channels so that we can report these events quickly and easily, so they can be investigated quickly and fairly, and that really matters. And make sure that we and indeed other people working in Parliament have confidence in those processes. And I think that's one of the challenges that Parliament itself and the political parties still haven't got right. Because if you have robust policies in place, then you can just point at the policy, explain how what happened was in contravention of that, it gets dealt with, and we can indeed all move on, which is what we want.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right, and I think it's interesting when you compare the kind of policies that we have in place in Parliament versus any other corporate workplace. In other corporate workplaces, these policies are really clear, very robust, investigations happen very quickly. But that doesn't really seem to be the case where we are, does it?
No, it doesn't, and I think that's part of the problem. Look, if somebody had been watching pornography on the checkout in Tesco's or in any other workplace, they'd have been out the door that afternoon. Mm-hmm. And that's the significant difference, and where so many of us felt let down over the course of the past few days, is that there wasn't that swift mechanism that could work. There wasn't the ability to say, well, look, here's a policy. It's in contravention of the policy. Then you can take all of the personalities out of it if something is in contravention of a clearly stated policy. And a lot of us have been calling for that for a long time. Look, put these in place so that you don't get swamped with this sort of protracted argument about what has happened and what has gone wrong. We want to put it all behind us. We want to be able to talk about Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, all of the issues that I know are impacting my constituents.
Mm-hmm. So we've heard today from the Speaker that he's going to pull together a Speakers' Conference, which is a pretty serious thing, to look at changing employment practices in Parliament. Do you think that's the right step, or do you think it kind of misses the mark a bit?
Well, look, I think that's an interesting proposal. A Speakers' Conference is serious, and that'll give us some time to look at the issues and consider it. But it's not just staffers, is it? This isn't about interactions between MPs and their staff, although that is indeed an issue. This is about interactions between members of Parliament themselves. And I want it to be a respectful workplace. I want people to be able to interact in a responsible and adult way with each other. I think there are some really interesting arguments now raging about whether there's access to too much alcohol in the Commons. There's also the suggestion that this is inevitable when you're working in a pressured environment, long hours. No, it's not. And there are plenty of other sectors that we could point out where people work very long hours in very pressured environments and don't have this sort of problem. So look, I'm just saying, let's get a policy in writing. And I would say specifically as a Conservative party, our whips should have a policy that they can then refer to, point out and go, look, X has infringed this, we need to suspend the whip, have an investigation. That absolutely should be carried out thoroughly and fairly, giving everybody the right to put across what has happened. But I think we do need to have this sort of fixed policy that people can identify and use when things go wrong.
Brilliant. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Caroline Noakes there, MP for Romsey and Southampton North, but also Chair of the Women and Equality Select Committee. Now, on to our next story, which is linked, and we have just been discussing it somewhat. This week, an inquiry was launched after Neil Parish referred himself for investigation following complaints from 2 female colleagues that he was watching adult content whilst in the House of Commons chamber. He subsequently stepped down from his role as an MP. Arlene, I think Caroline made a really good point there, didn't she? In the sense that this should have been dealt with very quickly, very swiftly, but also in line with what would have happened in any other workplace.
Yeah, I think that's fair comment. And I think part of the difficulty in Parliament has been caused because the proper processes aren't in place. They take far too long when somebody does make a complaint. I know, having spoken to some of the staff in Westminster, that they feel sometimes it's a power issue, that if they raise an issue against someone who has abused their power, that they don't feel that they can get satisfaction in terms of justice. So I think there are issues that need to be dealt with, and we should try and deal with those as quickly as possible to give confidence back in terms of what's going on in the Houses of Parliament. But I do think, I listened very carefully what Caroline said about Oliver Dowden's remarks about half of our MPs should be women. I have no difficulty with that, but how is he going to get there? Because I don't approve of quotas. I think quotas are wrong. I think they send out completely the wrong message. And the sort of message that it sends out is that you're only here because you're a woman and we couldn't, we have to find 50% of women. I just don't want that. I think if you can do it by encouraging, by having those policies that would encourage more women to step forward, then that's great. But I do not approve of quotas. I know the Labour Party engaged in all-women shortlists and those sorts of mechanisms. But as someone who has been a female in politics, I just think it's not the way to go. And I hope the Conservative Party isn't going to engage in quotas.
Mm-hmm. Well, I completely agree with you there, Arlene. I mean, I think one of the benefits of our party kind of believing in meritocracy is that every single person who makes it as an MP knows that you've got there because of kind of your talents and your hard work rather than because of one of your demographics. But Paul, as Arlene said there, the Labour Party do have some of these sort of quotas and all-women shortlists in place. What do you make of that?
I've always been opposed to them. I think, obviously, every party has a duty to make sure there are pathways into politics for people, regardless of their background. And I'm very happy for women and other groups who are underrepresented in Parliament to be encouraged. But I think when it comes to actually saying you will be a candidate for this seat only because of a particular biological trait, then I think you're into very dangerous territory, and actually possibly ruling out of contention people who might otherwise be better qualified. And I think arguably now with the Labour Party, if you are seriously talking about getting underrepresented people from the Labour movement into Parliament, then I think the Labour Party needs to look at working class communities, because the manner in which the Parliamentary Labour Party has been so dramatically transformed in recent decades into much more of a kind of metropolitan, middle-class, graduate kind of cohort. And arguably that's been one of the big contributory factors to why Labour has lost touch with ordinary working class people out there in the country. So if we are going to focus on people, that should be an area where we focus. But broadly, in terms of quotas, it's always been a no-no for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And obviously on that point about Labour losing touch, we are soon going to be talking about the fact that today is 25 years since that great New Labour victory in 1997. So stay with us for that. But also coming up after the break, we'll be discussing the ongoing war in Ukraine and the government's decision to send around 8,000 troops to Eastern Europe for military drills in the face of continued Russian aggression. And as ever, here on The Political Correction, we want to hear from you. So if you want to get involved in our conversation today, please email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. See you soon.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. And already loads of you getting in contact with us. We've got some views in on the historic Blair victory. I've got Daryl, who says, for me, the most memorable moment of Tony Blair's premiership was when he stood down. Arlene.
Yes, and David in Romney Marsh says, my first memories are Tony Blair with his wife telling the country that they will be whiter than white and purer than pure. Well, make your minds up about those words.
And Paul, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I've got a couple here on the Westminster bubble story. Tracy says, ban phones in the Commons. Work-related communications via phone should not be done in the Commons. And on Blair, Sue says, all we remember about him is destroying the economy, ruining education, a war starter, and feathering his own nest. Forgot uncontrolled immigration for votes and ruining the UK. So obviously in two minds there, I think, Sue, on Blair.
I'd say so. I think it's interesting, that point about phones at work, because I've got one here from Daniel who says, this phone use culture at work, it's a place of work and concentration is needed to fully engage and discuss voters' issues. I battle children's phones ringing in the classroom by parents calling. 6 can go off every hour. It's exhausting trying to teach. I guess the only point I'd make is that, there are very, very few / probably just one who sits there looking at porn in the chamber. Most of us are doing emails or actually hearing from our staffers about other things that are going on. So I think it's useful phone usage rather than anything else. But I do take the point. It's not exactly a good look when you see Parliament and everyone kind of going like this on their device. Arlene, do you have any more for us?
Yeah, so on the Westminster bubble story, Michael says, I lost respect for politics and politicians a decade ago. Every year standards gets worse. Hide behind that it's a minority argument. It's not. It's a majority, and they've all got their dirty secrets. It's just whose turn it is to be outed this week. So that's somebody that's very weary of politicians.
I think many of us are, actually. but moving on. Around 8,000 British soldiers are due to be sent to Eastern Europe to take part in military exercises, in what will be the largest deployment to take place since the Cold War. Troops will be placed in countries from Finland to North Macedonia, alongside dozens of tanks and more than 100 armoured vehicles. The Ministry of Defence has said the exercises will improve the ability of UK forces, working alongside other nations to deter Russian aggression away from Scandinavia and the Baltic states. I'm delighted to say that joining us to discuss this move is former British military intelligence officer Philip Ingram, MBE. Philip, thank you for joining us this morning. Firstly, do you think this is the right move by the British government?
Well, I think it's hugely the right move, but it's all messaging the way they're putting it out at the moment, because these things take a long, long time to plan and will have been in calendars for the last 3 to 5 years. And it takes a good year to plan getting this number of troops and the pieces of equipment to where they're going across Europe. So it's nothing new, and it has been, as I say, long planned.
Do you think that the optics of this could make it appear to Putin and the Russians that this is sort of an escalation from Britain?
Oh, those optics are being very deliberately put out that way, as in the statements that are coming out of our politicians every time a new budget has been approved or new weapon systems are being talked about or anything else. But remember, the Russians are using similar optics straight back to us. They've got this fantastic doctrine called maskirovka, which is all about masking, which is why they try and bluff everything. As they're going through it, and they're more than happy to develop lies. The difference is they will lie about what it is that they're doing. We will actually say what we're doing and do stuff, and then spin it up a little bit more, just so that it is emphasising it into the right places.
Well, Philip, based on your kind of vast military experience and knowledge, where do you see the war going from now?
You know, if I should be Chief of Defence Intelligence if I knew where that was going, and even he probably doesn't know. It's very, very difficult. It's going to go in a number of different directions. The Russians are not making the progress that they were expecting to, having switched from their attack into Kiev round to the east. They've failed at everything that they've done operationally so far. They haven't generated the major armoured force and thrust in that we'd all expected them to, and the Ukrainians are holding their own. And the Ukrainians are waiting to counterattack. So either the Russians are going to be fought to a standstill, and then we'll see more of what they've done and attacking centres of population to break the will of the people and therefore break the will of the politicians. Or we'll see them get to a point where the Ukrainians counterattack and start to push them out again. Both those scenarios are fairly dangerous. I don't see a scenario where the Russians are going to achieve even the limited objectives that they've set themselves, because they're just not up to it.
Thanks, Philip. Arlene?
Yeah, Philip, I was really struck by a comment from Fiona Hill, who used to be the senior director in the last administration in America for European and Russian affairs this morning. She was asked, is all of this talk about a Third World War a bit far-fetched? And she said, well, we're already in it, which I thought was, given everything that's been going on. I mean, what do you make of that sort of analysis, that we're heading towards an even worse situation? Because I know a lot of people are very concerned about all of this talk coming from Russia about the use of nuclear weapons.
Well, the difficulty is when we've got a conflict that involves, as the aggressors, one member of the permanent of the Security Council, the permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, and you've got at least 3 other members of the Security Council supplying weapons to counter that. It's very easy, whenever you're looking at things from an academic perspective or a political perspective, to spin it as the Third World War. And it all depends on how you define war. You could argue that for many, many years, we have been at war with initially the Soviet Union and then Russia in various guises. And that was the Cold War, the Third World War, was what Russia's doing and stirred in support in Afghanistan, and then with Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and then what they've done in Georgia and the support we've given. Has that all been elements of the Third World War? I'd argue we've probably been at a level of conflict that is below the threshold of what you describe as war. Ever since the end of the Second World War, we haven't come out of it yet. But is there, the more important question here, is there the potential for this to escalate? Well, we've got a nuclear power facing up against, 3 other nuclear powers facing up against NATO. We've got a nuclear power who has illegally invaded another sovereign country and has actually physically threatened the use of nuclear weapons. You can't sit back and ignore that fact, and you have to look at things and start to be prepared to deal with it. And I personally can see scenarios where Putin would get to a point where he could potentially consider the use of a small tactical nuclear device as something that would allow him to wrestle the initiative back. He's lost the initiative so far in everything that he's done, and that's dangerous.
Brilliant. Well, Philip, thank you for joining us this morning to share your insights there. Philip Ingram, former British military intelligence officer.
Thank you.
Now, Labour have admitted that Deputy Leader Angela Rayner was indeed present when Sir Keir Starmer was filmed having a beer with colleagues in Durham during lockdown last year. Some Tory MPs have urged police to reconsider their decision not to investigate the event, following fines being issued to Boris Johnson for attending a number 10 birthday party. Johnson's spokesperson said that the PM thinks the law should be applied equally at all times. Paul, I'm going to come to you first on this, because one of the key points that you've kind of made is, I think, that the most frustrating thing that you can see from politicians around COVID is the hypocrisy. Do you think that it appears that Starmer and Rayner are guilty of this too?
Very possibly. And my view simply, Deanna, is plague on all your houses with this kind of stuff. I mean, going back to what I said at the top of the show, I think most people are becoming a bit sick and tired of how Parliament is just now navel-gazing over a lot of this stuff. Now, you know, if people in Parliament, particularly those who argued the hardest for lockdown, have themselves been found to have contravened the rules, then in one respect, you know, my view is, well, it serves you right. You kind of deserve all of the scrutiny and the criticism that's coming your way, because you were the people who voted for laws which effectively stopped people from being with their loved ones when they were dying, stopped people attending weddings, even told people who they could have intimate sexual relations with. And if in some respect now you made a rod for your own back because people are now looking at what you did during the lockdown period, then frankly you deserve it. But ultimately, you know, as I said, I think people out there in the country are past this. They're past caring. They saw the story at the time, thought that the government, Boris Johnson and others, may have been hypocritical. Many people called on him to resign. He didn't. I suspect he's not going to. So I think most people's view now is, let's move on and talk about what matters to me. How am I going to put food on the table? How am I going to pay for my mortgage? There's a cost of living crisis. There's an energy crisis. There's a war in Europe. What are you doing about that?
Mm-hmm. Arlene, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, my thoughts are that Sir Keir Starmer is a lawyer. He will know the phrase that goes like this: he who comes to equity must come with clean hands. And it appears that he doesn't have completely clean hands. In other words, if you're going to criticise somebody for breaking a regulation or a law in relation to COVID, you better make sure that you're completely clean. And of course, we've seen this right throughout the United Kingdom. Nicola Sturgeon, of course, jumps on any bandwagon that calls on the Prime Minister to resign. And then the next day we find out that she's somewhere without a mask because that at the time was the regulation. I mean, it has become a bit of a farce, frankly. For those of us in Northern Ireland, of course, we had the Deputy First Minister going to an enormous funeral and political rally at the same time as she was telling people that it was limited to 10 for ordinary families. So, you know, this is going on right across the United Kingdom, making laws and then not abiding by those laws. I think people have made up their own judgments in relation to all of that. And the fact that we're still talking about it and dragging it out, people are just really fed up with it, Deanna. And I think it adds to what we were talking about in the first segment of the programme, that, you know, people just want them to concentrate on what's important. And they're not doing that, but instead in a tit-for-tat battle as to who broke which COVID regulation about 2 years ago. So it has to stop and people need to move on.
Yeah, well, I completely agree. But send us your views. Do you agree with our sentiment there? What do you make of all of this ongoing Partygate stuff? Well, coming up after the break, we'll be joined by Minister Tom Pursglove to discuss the overhaul of the immigration system. And we'll be discussing the High Court's decision this week that the government acted unlawfully in their handling of care homes at the start of the COVID pandemic. But of course, we want to hear from you today, so do get involved by emailing us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweeting us at gbnews. See you after the break.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, welcome back to the Political Correction, and yet loads more views coming in. We've got Janice here who says, why don't the government concentrate on the one thing most important, i.e. people coming across the channel illegally, rather than juggle 6 different things and get nothing much done? Put the top people on each different issue with good staff. Well, Janice, you'll be pleased to know our next discussion is on that very topic. But Paul, you've got some views for us as well?
Yeah, I've got a couple on Tony Blair. Thomas in Milton Keynes says, the first thing I thought when I saw Tony Blair on TV making his first speech outside Number 10 was, God help the country being led by this silver-tongued guy. And Malcolm says, the Blair years were years of destruction. It began the carve-up of the UK, and it was the destruction also of British lives in the Iraq War.
And Arlene?
Yeah, so on Westminster, we were talking about the culture there. Phil says if the Parliament is a place of work, perhaps it should shut down all the subsidised bars, or do MPs think that all workplaces should have alcohol easily available? And then Gary says, Rees-Lees, I'm not bothered. People forget that parliamentarians are human beings. Why should we expect them to be any different to anyone else? People who think they can have parliamentarians who don't make human mistakes are living on a different planet. So there's 2 different views on what's going on in Westminster.
Absolutely. I think that's the best thing about us on here on GB News, isn't it? We welcome all views, no matter how different and conflicting they may be. Now, the government's flagship Nationality and Borders Act passed through its final stages in Parliament this week. The legislation, the government says, will overhaul our immigration and asylum system in order to take back control of Britain's borders. But how effective will this be in deterring illegal crossings into the UK? Joining us now to discuss this is the Home Office Minister who led the new law through Parliament, Tom Pursglove. Tom, thank you for joining us this morning. I think firstly,
Pleasure.
what
Good
might...
to see you.
Likewise, I think what might be quite useful is if you could just broadly explain the changes that will be implemented in the new Nationality and Borders Act.
So obviously the new plan for immigration is a comprehensive plan that the government has introduced in response to this terrible illegal migration that we've been seeing into our country, and that I know your viewers are very, very concerned about, whether that be the small boat crossings or people coming across in the backs of lorries, both of which are hugely dangerous. And we have to get to grips and crack down on these evil criminal gangs that are responsible for this criminality, that take people's money, put them in great danger transporting them, and frankly don't care whether people make the trip safely or not. The Borders Bill delivers a comprehensive package, increases the penalties around arriving illegally and, of course, for people smuggling, makes sure that Border Force have got the powers that it needs to respond to these issues effectively, and that also just fundamentally overhauls what is the broken asylum system to make it fit for the future.
So one of the things that's been quite controversial in the news recently, Tom, is this plan to send those who come here illegally to Rwanda. There's been a lot of kickback about this. Are you convinced that that's actually going to work?
So we are determined to make sure that the Rwanda plan comes to fruition. The Prime Minister has said very clearly that he will do everything necessary, and that as a government we will do everything necessary to make this work. The fact is we have no alternative, and one of the things that frustrates me greatly, as it probably does you, that our opponents in the House of Commons often say that they disagree with the approach that we're taking, but offer nothing credible whatsoever in response in terms of what they would do differently. And I've always been clear that there is no one single intervention that will resolve this issue of itself. But I do think that the Rwanda plan, that economic development partnership with Rwanda will help to really sever the link between getting in a small boat, arriving in the United Kingdom, thinking that you're going to be here for a long length of time while your case is processed, and then potentially stay long term as well. We have to put a stop to these journeys, and I think that the Rwanda policy will help us to do that.
Well, you mentioned there, Tom, the economic plan. This is £120 million upfront to Rwanda, but the Times have reported recently that the cost per migrant could be between £20,000 and £30,000. How does that compare to now, and is it actually an effective use of taxpayers' money?
The point that I'd make is that, of course, at the moment we are spending exorbitant sums of money. So, for example, every day we are spending nearly £5 million in the asylum system on hotel accommodation. That is unacceptable, it is unsustainable, and it has to stop. What I think is important about the Rwanda policy is that we are paying that £120 million up front to establish the partnership. But then as we move forward, our intention is that the sort of money that we will pay across to the Rwandan government will be similar to the amounts that we're paying currently to process those cases in the United Kingdom. But of course, the key thing is that if the policy is successful in the way that we think it will be, those costs should then drop off very dramatically, because the deterrent effect and the effect of enacting the policy and delivering it should mean that the number of crossings that are being made in the first place are dramatically reducing. So in the longer term, not only should this help to save lives, but it should also help us to really get under control the costs of the system.
I'm going to throw to Paul. Paul has a question for you.
Yeah, Mr. Purslove, I mean, the bill, as you know, also includes giving power to the government to strip people of dual nationality of their British citizenship in certain circumstances where they've been seen to be supporting or promoting terrorism, for example. I have very grave concerns about that, because, frankly, that creates two tiers of citizen in this country, doesn't it? It means that if you happen to have migrant parents or one migrant parent, and as a result of that you have another nationality and another passport, then despite the fact that you could have been born and bred and raised in Britain, the government can say, we're going to take your British citizenship away, in a way that they couldn't do to me, for example, because I don't have that dual nationality. In principle, that's completely wrong. You must accept that.
No, I don't accept that. And actually what we're talking about here is high harm individuals who pose a risk to our national security. And the deprivation of citizenship powers have existed for over 100 years. And all that we've done through the Act is to essentially change some of the notification processes around this, so that where individuals, for example, are in a battlefield in Syria, and quite reasonably it is not possible to establish contact with them for obvious reasons, that notification can be served to file, but they still have in due course the appeal right should they make themselves known to the authorities. So this doesn't change or add in scope anybody additionally to those who would have been affected by deprivation powers in the past that have been supported under successive governments of both sides. This is purely about the deprivation notification. And actually what we did do, I think very constructively, was accepted some good suggestions and some good amendments from Lord Anderson of Ipswich that have added additional safeguards and oversight to that in terms of judicial process, but also internal Home Office checking processes to make sure that this power is used properly and appropriately in all circumstances.
But these people are our problem, aren't they? Shamima Begum, for example, who went from Tower Hamlets to Syria, she was born and bred in Britain. She was a product of our system. What right have we got to say you're now no longer a British national? You are Bangladeshi's problem, I think, which is where her forebears came from, and she just happens to have a Bangladeshi passport. We should be taking responsibility for our own people and what they're doing, and putting them through our own justice system, shouldn't we?
I think that this is a proportionate response. And as I say, the deprivation powers are long-standing, long-established, and have been used appropriately for many years now. And I think where you've got, for example, high-harm individuals who are in the battlefield in Syria, I think the British people would be slightly surprised if we wanted to let them back into this country with all the risks that they present.
Tom, can we talk about the measures in the bill to create a kind of one-stop shop for asylum seekers, but also new kind of detention centres here in the UK? Because I think there is concern by some of our communities that there might be one of these centres kind of built on their back door. How would you respond to that?
So I think you're alluding to the sort of Linton-on-Ouse arrangement that we're putting in place, which is a new accommodation centre. We know that accommodation centres work, and there's best practice from other parts of the world about where this happens and where these centres are established. And what we're trying to do is, it is not detention. Obviously, detention powers are only able to be used where there is a realistic prospect of someone being removed from the country imminently. What we're talking about in terms of the Linton-on-Ouse approach, for example, is through the bill we're establishing accommodation centres, which mean that rather than having these exorbitant hotel costs, individuals will be able to be located in these accommodation centres while their claims and their cases are processed. But what's important about them is it's about bringing the caseworking function alongside the accommodation, so that we can hopefully then engage with individuals, process those cases more quickly, which I think is something that everybody wants to see because it makes sense. Those who require sanctuary, we want them to have it as quickly as possible. Those who've got no right to be here, we think they should be removed without delay. And this should help us to do that, as well as getting these costs under control, because clearly £5 million a day on hotels just isn't acceptable or sustainable.
Thanks, Minister. Arlene?
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask the Minister, there was an incredible reaction to the Rwanda plan from everybody from the Archbishop of Canterbury downwards. And I mean, I have to say, it looks as if the numbers have already fallen away in terms of those people who are making that treacherous journey across the Channel. If that is the case, isn't it true that the deterrent action is already working?
I think it's early days, Arlene, to be able to comment authoritatively as to the effect that the policy's had. But I genuinely do think that we had to shift the dynamic and really move the dial, because the status quo just couldn't endure. And I do think that there is a significant deterrent effect associated with this by ending that link between getting in a small boat, for example, and coming to Britain and then thinking you've got a very realistic prospect of remaining in Britain indefinitely, because we just can't continue with the number of cases and the number of people making these crossings. So it is early days. We've seen obviously mixed reporting around this in all the different newspapers who've been covering it. Some people saying they definitely won't make the trip now because of the policy, people saying that they will still make the trip. But I think that overall what we will find is that individuals, as they are relocated to Rwanda, I think it will have a deterrent effect, because it is effectively severing that link that we know has been so powerful in driving that terrible, evil trade that is propagated by these people smugglers to date.
Minister, just one final question from me. Of course, the Nationality and Borders Act has just very recently been granted royal assent. On what sort of timescales are we operating here for people to kind of see a tangible difference?
I think it's fair to say that it's difficult to put a definitive timescale on precisely when the whole package of measures will deliver in the way and to their fullest maximal extent in the way that we would all hope. But I think you're already seeing some of that change that we are determined to see delivered happening already. So the Prime Minister's announcement around Rwanda is clearly an important part of this. The approach that we've taken in the Channel in terms of that greater Royal Navy involvement, drawing on their expertise, making sure that we no longer have beach landings is important. We're already in the process of transforming our caseworking, trying to make sure that cases are dealt with much more expeditiously to give that certainty either way. And then, for example, the package of measures in the bill, some of those will begin to be enacted within 2 months. So there's a gradual process. We've had to prioritise because this is fundamental reform. But I think as we gradually shift this along and as we shift the dial, people will see us get this under control. And I think it is long overdue. People have been fed up of this illegal migration to our country. Understandably, in the referendum, people voted for proper control. We've delivered the points-based immigration system in terms of legal migration, and of course we'll also continue to have safe and legal routes for people to come to this country through, in line with our proud tradition. But we did have to get this illegal migration under control, and I think over the coming months and years, people will see a marked difference.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Tom Pursglove there, MP for Corby, but also Home Office Minister in charge of driving the Nationality and Borders Bill through Parliament. Now, this week, the High Court ruled that government policy on discharging untested patients from hospital to care homes at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic was unlawful. The legal challenge was brought about by Dr. Kathy Gardner and Faye Harris, who both lost their fathers to COVID. The two said there had been failures in protecting elderly care home residents from the virus, with Dr. Gardner saying the homes had been neglected and let down by the government. So, Paul, do you think that this was the right ruling?
I think it probably was. I think the broader question, Deanna, in many respects, is why didn't we go for that much more targeted approach from the very outset? I mean, the truth was, COVID has only ever presented a threat to a small minority of people in terms of people who suffered serious symptoms or were at risk from dying. Now, I don't say for a moment that means we should, leave those people to their own devices or forget about them. I argued at the outset that what we should have is that targeted approach where we threw a shield effectively around the most vulnerable people in society, such as those in care homes, while allowing the rest of the nation to go about its business. But what we effectively did was quarantined the entire population, even though the vast majority of the population was healthy and were under no personal threat from COVID. So, I mean, I have to say, I think that was a fundamental failure from the beginning. And I think now the bill is landing in many respects. What it meant in terms of that hard lockdown and not taking that targeted approach by ring fencing people in care homes and other vulnerable people is that we've got a national health service crisis, we've got a backlog of operations, we've got undetected cancers and heart disease, etc. We've got the economy having been hit in a serious way and businesses now going bankrupt and people having lost their jobs. So yeah, in terms of the ruling, fine, but I think we need a much broader debate about hard lockdown and what the implications have been.
Yeah, no, I think I'd agree, and it's something that we've discussed quite often on this show, isn't it? I guess one of the difficulties, kind of looking back to this specific story and people kind of being discharged without testing, is when you're thinking back to the very early stages of the pandemic, when we knew very little about this virus, when we didn't really have test capacity, do you think we can kind of understand why some of those decisions were made prior to us having all the knowledge and capacity that we needed?
I mean, look, there's no question that the government were dealing with something quite new. They were almost operating from hour to hour in many respects and making decisions on the information that was in front of them. So, of course, in a situation like that, where you're dealing with a novel virus in that respect, then mistakes will be made, and I think we have to accept that mistakes were made right across the world in many respects. However, what I don't think is excusable is effectively following the Chinese model of lockdown. I mean, some of the government advisors have openly said that we followed that model. We didn't at first think we could get away with it because the regime here and the culture here isn't as authoritarian as it is in China, but then it looked like we might get away with it. That's what we decided to do. And as I've said before, there was enormous mission creep throughout the period of lockdown. It went from squashing the sombrero and then we'll all get back to normal to then, making sure everyone was vaccinated before we got back to normal. And that kind of just seemed to run for months. And I think if you look at countries, Sweden and Japan, for example, which didn't lock down as hard, then they don't seem to have actually done any worse than us. So there's a number of questions there.
Thanks, Paul. Now, teachers at a Catholic school in London have gone on strike over the cancellation of a talk by a children's author whose books feature gay characters. Governors at Croydon's John Fisher School voted not to cancel the visit of Simon James Green, contrary to the Archdiocese of Southwark's recommendation. In a statement, the Archdiocese said, "Literature that insults the faith understandably causes offence to many Christians, and as such has no place in a Catholic school." Arlene, what are your opinions on this story? Because it appears there are so many levels to it, aren't there?
Well, there are so many levels to it, but I mean, I think for me, the issue is if you are attending a Catholic school, you would be expected to learn about the Catholic faith and learn about what it means in your everyday life. And therefore, I think that governors of a Roman Catholic school are absolutely entitled to decide if someone is writing about things which they would view as sexually inappropriate, and I understand this author has been quite explicit in some of his work, then I think it's a matter for them as to whether they allow this gentleman in or not. I know that people will talk about free speech, and the right to free speech is absolute, But you make that choice when you send your child to a Roman Catholic school. You know that they're going to be brought up in that ethos and in that faith. So, I mean, you make that choice early on. So you cannot expect, I mean, it's the same if you were going to a Muslim school. They certainly would not be inviting people in who would bring very contrary views to their faith and their religion. In fact, it would be quite the opposite. So I think we just need to remember that this is a Roman Catholic school. It is not a so-called state school, and that needs to be reflected in the discussion.
Mm-hmm. So, Paul, over to you on this, because we know you love a good strike, and these teachers are now going on strike based on this decision. What have you made of this story?
I mean, I have a lot of sympathy with what Arlene said, actually. I think if you're going to have a system where you have faith schools and you allow those faith schools to teach their orthodoxy to children, then those faith schools are naturally not going to have a situation where anything goes. They're not going to want a situation where people might come into the school and teach something that is directly counter to that orthodoxy. So you know, I can understand where the school is coming from on this, because I think it wasn't as simple as just banning an LGBT author. They were worried about the content of what that author had written and what might be imparted to the children. But, you know, in terms of the strike, OK, it's a democratic strike. I support the principle of people withdrawing their labour. I'd also like to see the unions actually speaking up more vocally about the Batley Grammar School teacher, frankly, who is still in hiding today because he imparted knowledge to children there as part of, you know, what we call free speech. And it seems to me that the unions have done nothing about that, not run a campaign, not held a strike ballot. And that seems to me a bit of selective outrage. And I think they should show a bit more courage on some of these issues.
Thanks, Paul. And stay with us, because coming up in the next hour on The Political Correction, 25 years on since Tony Blair led New Labour to that landslide victory, we're looking at his legacy. We're also going to be discussing the cost of living crisis. But as ever, we want to hear your views, so we're asking, on the 25th anniversary of Labour's landslide, what are your most memorable moments of that era? Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. See you soon.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News. Coming up this hour, 25 years on from New Labour's historic 1997 landslide, we'll discuss the legacy of this momentous event. The cost of living crisis continues, leading supermarkets to cut the cost of goods. But is this going to be effective and sustainable? And our regular Common Ground segment with Imam Ajmal Mazroor. That plus plenty more after the latest news.
Good morning. It's just coming up to 2 minutes past 11. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. Commons Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle is calling for radical reform after a series of bullying and sexual misconduct allegations involving MPs in Parliament. Writing in The Observer, Sir Lindsay says he wants to make the House a safe and inclusive place to work. He believes working practices need to be overhauled, including stopping MPs from directly employing their staff. The statement comes after MP Neil Parish resigned after being caught watching pornography in the Commons. Chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, Caroline Noakes, told GB News policy reform is overdue.
If somebody had been watching pornography on the checkout in Tesco's or in any other workplace, they'd have been out the door that afternoon. And that's the significant difference, and where so many of us felt let down over the course of the past few days, is that there wasn't that swift mechanism that could work. There wasn't the ability to say, well, look, here's a policy. It's in contravention of the policy. Then you can take all of the personalities out of it if something is in contravention of a clearly stated policy. And a lot of us have been calling for that for a long time.
Tory party chairman Oliver Dowden says the Conservative Party will make sure its candidate list becomes more equal. He told the Sunday Telegraph it should reflect the fact that half the population are women. Around a quarter of Tory candidates at the 2019 election were women, but Labour managed more than half. Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries says ensuring a majority of women in Parliament could help tackle Westminster sleaze. Ukraine's military says 20 civilians have been evacuated from a steel plant in the besieged city of Mariupol. Unverified footage released overnight appears to show buses leaving the Azovstal steelworks. Russia's defence ministry claims the number of people who managed to flee is around 46. That's despite President Vladimir Putin ordering troops to contain those sheltering inside. Meanwhile, President Volodymyr Zelensky claims Russia has lost more than 23,000 soldiers so far in its invasion of Ukraine.
All the leaders of the free world know what Russia has done to Mariupol, and there will be responsibility for this for Russia. Many of the world leaders are trying to help save our heroic defenders of the city. This was discussed in great detail with the UN Secretary-General during his visit to Kyiv. We're doing everything to ensure that the evacuation mission from Mariupol does get carried out.
While the US Speaker of the House has met with President Zelensky in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, Nancy Pelosi told the Ukrainian leader that his fight is a fight for everyone. She also said the US is committed to the long haul and stands firmly with Ukraine as it battles what she called Putin's diabolic invasion. Angelina Jolie's visit to Lviv in Ukraine has interrupted as air raid sirens warned people to take shelter from a Russian attack. The Hollywood actress had been visiting displaced children at a railway station as a special envoy for the United Nations Refugee Agency. She was seen rushing out of the station and into a waiting car. Previously, she said she wants to do everything possible to ensure the protection and basic human rights of refugees in the region. The Business Secretary has written to North Sea oil and gas firms asking them to come up with a plan to increase domestic production. Kwasi Kwarteng says the industry must invest in homegrown energy production to boost the British economy and bring down consumer bills in the long term. He said firms must also set out plans for investment in clean energy ahead of a meeting in the coming weeks. COVID guidance in Scotland is changing from today. Those with the virus will no longer need to self-isolate, but will still be advised to stay at home. Contact tracing has also come to an end as case numbers continue to fall. The number of COVID infections has dropped for the 5th successive week, with about 1 in 5 people having the virus. The Prince of Wales has called for the nation's dwindling historic natural habitats to be renewed. It's as he unveiled a collection of 70 ancient woodlands and 70 trees dedicated to the Queen to mark her Platinum Jubilee. Prince Charles says these precious assets need to be preserved for future generations.
If we are to create the ancient trees of the future, we must plant more trees in hedgerows, in fields, churchyards and avenues.
This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now it's back to Deanna.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News. This is The Political Correction. We're here for the next hour to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. Coming up this hour, today marks 25 years since Tony Blair led New Labour into its historic landslide victory in the 1997 general election, changing the course of British politics forever. We'll speak to three people from across the political world who were there about the legacy of this momentous event. We'll discuss the ongoing P&O ferry situation with the former chief executive of Porsche and Lamborghini. And today, on the 25th anniversary of that Labour victory, we want to know what are your most memorable moments of the Blair years. Let us know by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction. Today marks the 25th anniversary of the Labour Party's historic 1997 landslide general election victory. A reformed New Labour, led by a young, vibrant Tony Blair, swept up seats across the nation, decimating John Major's Conservatives and taking home a parliamentary majority of 223. This was the first general election victory for Labour in a quarter of a century and ended the Tories' 18-year-long stint in office. However, despite this colossal success at the start and two more consecutive election wins, the years under Blair and Brown were rocked with controversies, steering their way through societal changes and reforming the way we are governed. The radical changes Mr Blair and his team made to the Labour Party, removing Clause 4 and adopting a more liberal economic and social agenda, caused rift within the party and divided opinion across the nation, both of which are still very much being felt today. Whatever your views on Tony Blair and indeed the Labour Party, it's impossible to deny that this was a truly momentous occasion in our political history that's altered our democracy forever. Well, joining us now to discuss the events of that night in 1997 and the legacy of New Labour is Associate Editor of the Daily Mirror, Kevin Maguire. Kevin, thank you for joining us today. So, first off, I want to hear about that night. Tell me how you were feeling when that exit poll came out.
Yeah, no, I remember it well because I'd been covering politics. I could go back to Thatcher through John Major. And I think it was just astonishment at the scale of the victory. Everybody knew Tony Blair and Labour were going to win. John Major and the Tories were very ragged at that stage. It was the end of 18 years of Conservative government. There was a lot of sleaze around. They'd lost their reputation for economic competence, although the economy was actually growing again. And it was just the scale of that Labour victory. It was kind of shocking because you didn't think it would be so big, and the Conservatives went down to their biggest defeat since the Battle of Waterloo, and it was the scale of it. I went to the Royal Festival Hall where Tony Blair finally arrived, and he made that New Dawn over Britain speech. Although I will admit I was very tired, and I left the festival hall before he made that speech, and I watched it on TV because many of my colleagues at the Mirror who I'd worked with weren't allowed to go. So I went to watch it with them, and then, of course, it was all staged wonderfully. We've seen him now in Downing Street when he entered on the Friday afternoon with Cherie, his wife. That Labour got a lot of supporters waving flags, and he gave yet another speech saying he was going to rule for the entire country. It was going to be New Labour. And there was an incredible air of optimism. Some of it was carried through. Some of it, as you quite rightly point out about controversies later, wasn't. So it was kind of both a great success, that Labour government, but it did have its failures.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, looking back now with the benefit of hindsight, what is your overall verdict on that period between 1997 and 2010? Do you think Labour just about struck the tone right?
I think they did. I think they did great things on the economy. It went wrong in the end with a global financial collapse, but there was a sustained economic growth. The minimum wage came in. Employment rights were stronger. They transformed health and education from where they were. You had wonderful achievements such as peace in Northern Ireland, devolution, Scotland, Wales, which I do think is rather good. They brought in equal rights, a bit of civil partnerships for gay people, no longer discriminated in that way. Downside, well, you could say they could have done more on helping the poorest in society, although the number of people in poverty did go down. You could say Iraq was a huge error. I do believe that that was the case. But you think Britain was better at the end of that period than it was at the beginning, and I think that's one way of measuring the success of a government. Yeah, they could have done better in a lot of areas, but I think they did transform the country and transform the country for the better. Although the election of the Labour government itself in '97 was a sign the country was transforming and changing itself.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kevin. Now, you mentioned Northern Ireland there, so it would be remiss of me not to bring in Arlene Foster. Arlene.
Yeah, hi, Kevin. I mean, yeah, the Belfast Agreement came around in 1998. Some people argue that a lot of the groundwork was carried out before 97. I presume you would have a view on that. But from my perspective, I was battling against the Belfast Agreement because I was one of the baby barristers at the time that was... Actually, there's a photograph out today showing Jeffrey Donaldson being elected to Parliament in 1997 at the same election. So he's 25 years in Parliament today, and I'm in the background looking incredibly young, that's to say. They said. But anyway, moving on. Of course, there were problems with the Belfast Agreement, which we're still seeing today in relation to the release of terrorists and the fact that there's a lot of legacy issues that still haven't been dealt with. And those issues should have been agreed at the time, but weren't. And unfortunately, us in Northern Ireland are still coping with that. Do you think he was too soft on Adams and McGuinness at that time, the leaders of Sinn Féin, and give them too much?
Yeah, Arlene, I do. I think John Major, as you say, groundwork was done. I think he deserves a huge amount of credit, as well as Tony Blair. And of course, he was visiting Northern Ireland ahead of the referendum. He was made full use of, but he deserves a big tick for that. But Arlene, I think when you were opposing the Belfast Agreement, you were on the wrong side of history. I think your party's changed now. I was there at the talks. I was there when the agreement was signed. I recall it was Good Friday, as you will. It was snowing. It didn't, in one way, feel very historic after days and nights of negotiations. Everyone was cold and tired, and to some extent dirty from standing outside that building. But the problem with the IRA, Adams and McGuinness, I understand from your community and your background why you feel that, but it was somehow having to shift them and to get them to bring others with them. And yeah, perhaps in some ways problems were put off rather than dealt with immediately. But I think Northern Ireland is in a much better position now than it was 25 years ago or 24 years ago when that agreement was signed. You live in the most politicised part of the United Kingdom, a corner of Ireland that is just incredibly political, and it was never going to be easy. But the DUP at the time opposed the agreement. The official unionists backed it, and I think David Trimble, who stuck his neck out, deserves a lot of credit for doing what he did. He was very brave. He was very bold. And let's remember, much of the world was willing Northern Ireland on to make the peace. Not least Bill Clinton in the US, who of course then subsequently came over and campaigned for the yes vote in the referendum, which was a resounding result.
Well, Kevin, Arlene, I think we could probably leave the two of you to discuss this for a good 20 minutes, if not longer. Yes, maybe we save that discussion for another day. But Kevin, thank you for joining us this morning. That was Kevin Maguire, the Associate Editor of the Daily Mirror. Now, we've heard lots of stories about Labour victories that night, but there's always another side to the story. So what was it like for John Major and his team, who watched their people get rejected by the British people en masse overnight? Well, joining us here to tell us a little bit more about this is Jonathan Haslam, who served as Chief Communications Secretary to John Major himself. Jonathan, I'm sure your reflections of that election night are a little bit different, aren't they?
They are. They mirror what, no pun intended, what Kevin was talking about in terms of tiredness, because I think we were all pretty tired And as a civil servant, of course, I had a different role. My job is to serve the government of the day and to oversee the change between one administration and another, and do it in ways which are deemed by some to be, unnecessarily hasty, and others just a clear demonstration of democracy in power and in action. And that's what we tried to do. As Kevin said, I think the scale of the defeat was the thing that was amazing. I had left Downing Street the night before, around about 8 o'clock, and woke up at 3 to go back in and caught the news. And looking at the maps, it was quite astonishing. It was also quite frightening. It was almost like a warfare, as you saw blue turning to red across huge swathes of the country. And from my perspective, knowing John Major, and having worked for him for 6.5 years, all told, there's a bit of personality there. I think if you're in Downing Street, you do get used to people. That doesn't impose upon your responsibilities to act in a very impartial way. But it was a big change, and it's quite emotional. And it also meant that I lost my job, although I did go on to work for the government, working in fact for David Blunkett, which was quite revelatory.
John Major, because I think disappointment was expected, but probably not on the scale that he saw it.
I think it was quite stunning. John Major at the time was very, very tired. He'd been out campaigning relentlessly all the way through, and he'd had a backlog, of course, of dissent within the party, sleaze, as we say it today, and sadly still a prevalent issue. But he led from the front, and whatever people say, and I think his legacy now is becoming stronger with every passing year, he had principles and he upheld them. And it's interesting and delightful to see Arlene on the programme as well, because, as Kevin mentioned, John Major's esteem has risen because against all expectations, he did take the opportunity of something of an olive branch from the IRA, and it has led to considerable change and peace within Northern Ireland, which can only be positive. And the other thing I'd mention, I think, overall, is to say that, yes, Kevin talked a lot about the issues that New Labour dealt with and whether or not they ended up on the plus or the minus side. I think it's interesting, with the benefit of 25 years distance, to say, yes, those changes are made, but have they stayed the course and worked out the way in which people had anticipated they would? And certainly devolution's a good thing, but if you look at the Scottish administration, you now have to ask significant questions about how effective the SNP are and the nature of the regime being run in Scotland, which I think is disappointing and also extremely worrying in many respects. But there are other good things that happen, certainly the predominance of work on the National Health Service, education. And one of the biggest changes that's actually happened at about day 2, which was a very sensible move to give the Bank of England independence in setting interest rates. And that has stood the test of time, and it's been a good thing to take that key economic policy matter out of the hands of politicians and give it into the hands of real experts.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for joining us this morning. That was Jonathan Haslam, CBE, former Chief Communications Secretary to John Major. But now for a slightly different take on the events of 1997. We're joined here in the studio by Lord Maurice Glassman, who's a Labour peer and founder of the Blue Labour faction, who promote democratic socialism and aim to reconnect the Labour Party with its working class core. Lord Glassman, welcome to the show. So, same question for you. What do you remember of that New Labour victory back in 1997?
Well, I was just watching it on the telly, I think, like a lot of people. And obviously there was the elation that my team had won. Mm-hmm. That was an overwhelming memory of that. But also still a deep confusion about what would be different about this government, what would be significantly different about it. And that kind of was a nagging anxiety through the whole early period. So, for example, when Jonathan Haslam says about the interest rates, it was this delegation of economic responsibility to experts, seemed to people like me sort of an abdication of political responsibility and an indication that maybe Labour wasn't going to challenge the Thatcher years, the domination of finance capital, the embrace of globalisation. These were the anxieties underpinning that elation that night.
Mm-hmm. So I'm very keen to bring in Paul on this one, because, Paul, I'm sure you'll have your own memories from 97, but what questions do you have for Lord Glassman?
Well, I mean, not for the first time, I find myself in agreement with Maurice on what he's just said there. I mean, my own assessment of the Blair years, I think, is that it was a huge missed opportunity. In 97, you had this massive majority of 179, I think it was. And could have been used as a platform on which to really transform the economy, transform society, challenge the power of capital. But the main tenets of Thatcherism economically were kept in place, in my view. And Maurice, is your assessment too, as mine is, that actually that embrace of an economic liberalism as well as a social liberalism by Blair and New Labour sowed the seeds in many respects for the disconnect that later happened with the working class and ultimately led to Brexit and the 2019 election?
Oh, Paul, well, it's good to see you, but completely agree. But that wasn't initially so obvious. There were straws in the wind, but clearly there was a huge coalition that went into New Labour. And it was a coalition between the old Labour base, the industrial working class, in the northeast, the northwest, and the Midlands, and an increasingly important professional managerial class that was particularly predominant within the public services and within the City of London. And what happened is that class became the dominant class within that coalition. So I'd say, Paul, that it was even worse. There was a progressive abandonment of those places, and that led to the politics that we have now.
And Lord Glassman, you wrote back in 2015 that you predicted Labour would be wiped out in a few years because they would lose the working class. And obviously the 2019 election is potentially a bit indicative of that. What can Labour do to restore their kind of credibility?
Well, this is the fundamental issue that's going on now. There was a complete rupture of the historic affections of working class to Labour. That was the fundamental thing. I mean, when I grew up, it was instinctively the case that you voted Labour. You didn't really give it too much thought, and you knew where they were. And what you knew that they were was that there'd be a bigger role for the state in the economy. There would be intervention in that regard. And it would be in favour of Labour, in favour of people generally who worked for a living and were dependent on their wages for their survival, and a commitment to the places that they lived. And those were the three rough orientations you could depend on Labour, where you would consider that the Conservatives would look on the more wealthy in that way and support them and the places that they lived. But there was a progressive sense of disenchantment and abandonment in those places because globalisation was the dominance of finance, and the dominance of finance led to increased concentration in London and for those who already had. So this is the issue. Is there a constructive alternative to that? And what you have now is this whole thing with levelling up. Can Labour take that and genuinely commit itself to redistribution of assets, of regional banks, so that local areas can have access to capital? Because that's the issue. There was this huge transfer of wealth to the city, and that was the basis of the financial crash.
Well, Lord Glassman, thank you so much for your insight today. We'd love to get you back to talk in more detail. Lord Glassman there, member of the House of Lords and founder of Blue Labour. Stay with us, because coming up next, we'll discuss more about the P&O Ferries scandal with a former chief executive of Porsche, Lamborghini and BMW. And the cost of living crisis rages on, but some supermarkets are trying to help. Will it work? This is The Political Correction. Don't go anywhere.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. Now, the P&O Ferry saga continues, and this week demonstrators attempted to block the main entrance to one of the company's terminals. The protests, which were organised by the RMT union, are of course over the sacking of 800 workers across the UK back in March. The union said it would be urging passengers to boycott P&O services. Well, to discuss the saga with us, I'm delighted to say we're joined by technology investor and former CEO of Porsche and BMW, Kevin Gaskell. Kevin, what did you make of this? Because you must have engaged with unions in your role in the past, but how would you have handled it differently?
You know, I've led 15 companies and I've had to lead turnarounds at 6 of those. And every time it starts with the people. So we've very successfully led turnarounds. We've taken businesses from very difficult situations to be very successful. But it starts with the people. It has to start with the people. And I think the most shocking part of what I saw as one leader watching another company being led was the way that the message was given to the team, which was appalling. It was simply appalling. And, you know, when you're leading a turnaround, you've got a number of aspects that you have to adhere to. First is legal. There are very clear rules and legal guidelines around how you can make people redundant and what the process is. And, of course, you have to adhere to those. The second is the ethical component of treating people properly. You're affecting lives here, you're affecting jobs. And as a leader of a business, your responsibility is to make sure that any transition is handled in the most effective way possible to help people. The business may have to change its structure. And of course, you know, look at P&O and it's gone through the pandemic and Brexit and all of those background reasons. But I've led businesses where we've also gone through colossal shifts in the market. And we've had to change our business structure and change our business model. But ultimately, we've come through it, and we've been very successful. You know, at Porsche, we went from number 32 in the market to number 1 over 4 years. We did that with the people. It's about capturing hearts and minds. And so for me, the biggest issue about this whole saga was watching the way that people were frankly badly treated, in my opinion. And ultimately, as chief executive, you never want to see your company get bad PR. And what this has done has just been horrendous. I mean, the impact on their P&L of the fallout must just be extraordinary.
Thanks, Kevin. Paul?
Yeah, Kevin, I wonder if you share my view, and you touched on it there, that actually trade unions can and often do play a very positive role in the workplace. And it is far better for a management to take that on board and engage with unions than to treat them, for example, in the way P&O did. So, for example, productivity is arguably improved where people feel they've got a collective voice that's being listened to, that management is taken on board their concerns. And the evidence shows that often leads to a happier workforce. Do you share that view?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I took over a company called Fairline when it had gone through 10 years of losses. We're a very large manufacturing company. We made big boats, luxury £5 million motor yachts. And my first meeting, quite honestly, with the team, we had 1,500 staff, and it was a unionized business. And my first meeting as CEO, I thought I was going to get thumped before I got out of the room. It was that aggressive. Now, the aggression wasn't towards me. It was towards the fact that the people in the business were passionate about making this business successful again. And I had to create a relationship very, very quickly with the union leaders to make sure that we all understood that there's only one version of the truth. You know, we are where we are. This is where the business is. But we share the ambition to turn this into a very successful business again. And so that relationship was my first priority. It was absolutely critical to make sure people understood we were all in the same team here. This was not a competition, and this was not aggression. We needed to work together. It took us 14 months to get that into profit after 10 years of losses. And it was the unions working with the unions that helped us to achieve that.
Thanks, Kevin. And sorry to cut this a little bit short, but Kevin, we do appreciate your time this morning. That's Kevin Glassman there. Stay with us, but first we are going to go and see what the latest headlines are.
Thank you. It's 11:34. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. Commons Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle is calling for radical reform after a series of bullying and sexual misconduct allegations involving MPs in Parliament. Writing in The Observer, Sir Lindsay says he wants to make the House a safe and inclusive place to work. The statement comes after MP Neil Parish resigned after being caught watching pornography in the Commons. Ukraine's military says 20 civilians have been evacuated from a steel plant in the besieged city of Mariupol. Unverified footage released overnight appears to show buses leaving the Azovstal steelworks. Russia's defence ministry claims the number of people who managed to leave is around 46. The business secretary has written to North Sea oil and gas firms asking them to come up with a plan to increase domestic production. Kwasi Kwarteng says the industry must invest in homegrown energy production to boost the British economy and bring down consumer bills in the long term. He said firms must also set out plans for investment in clean energy ahead of a meeting in the coming weeks. COVID guidance in Scotland is changing from today. Those with the virus will no longer need to self-isolate, but will still be advised to stay at home. Contact tracing has also come to an end as case numbers continue to fall. Primary school children across the UK will be given a commemorative book to mark the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. Children will be able to trace the highlights of the royal reign through a story featuring a young girl called Isabella. TV, online and DAB+ radio, it'll be back to political correction.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. Now, Sunday is a special day for Christians, but we acknowledge that faith comes in all shapes and sizes. So each week on The Political Correction, we aim to talk to someone at the heart of his or her community to discuss what brings us together, in other words, our common ground. And this week, we're delighted to be joined by Imam Ajmal Masroor to discuss the big issues of the day. Imam, thank you for joining us. And of course, Ramadan is just about over.
Good morning. That's correct. We're fasting. Today is the last day of our fast. 30 days have passed pretty fast. And tomorrow is going to be Eid, celebration of 30 days of achievement. You know, it's amazing what we can achieve when you put your mind to it. Neuroscientists say if you want to change a habit, you need to repeat the same thing between 21 to 40 days. So we've been doing exactly that. For 30 days, we've been repeating good habits, such as eating less, eating more responsibly, drinking better drink so that our bodies would be more in tune with our natural needs and yearning. We've been good with our sleep. We've been good with our spirituality, especially donations and charity has been wonderful. We've been donating a lot more, being beneficial, looking after ourselves, our families, our neighbors, our relatives. So all these connections, corrections, and amazing times to reflect and contemplate has been the great 30 days of achievements, in my view, and tomorrow we'll be celebrating it.
And of course, this really is a time in your faith when communities do come together, don't they?
Yes, we do. And did you know Muslim community in the UK may be less than 3% of the total population, but I think we donate a lot more than anybody else. And I say that with great pride and smile on my face. 130 million pounds of donation was collected last year in the month of Ramadan alone. This year, it is predicted to be 150 million. Can you imagine? Only 3 to 4 million Muslims live in this country, and yet they donate 130 million pounds in 1 month alone. That's an amazing achievement. Looking after the needy, the poor, the vulnerable, coming together to solve our bigger issues in our society. We do it very well, and we demonstrate our commitment to it in the month of Ramadan more than anyone else.
Well, that was astonishing, and I didn't know that, so thank you for sharing it. And what other topics did you want to talk about today?
Sadly, not related to my spiritual journey or our spiritual path as we've been staying clean and pure. Unfortunately, some of the bad things happening in our country and our parliament has dominated the headlines. One of them is MPs and their behavior, sexual misconduct in some cases, watching porn, harassing women, We heard from a prominent MP who said she was pinned against the wall. It really is a disgrace that male MPs, sadly, have been behaving, some of them, not all of them, of course, pretty badly in the parliament. One behavior of such nature is too bad as far as I'm concerned. It really demonstrates and also shows men in a very bad light. I think we need to have an overhaul. We need to have a rethink of the way we have been behaving, or men have been behaving in Parliament. And Parliament should not be a place where testosterone, alcohol, and power should be the dominant factors. It should be more compassionate, more human, more jovial, as well as more civilized and courteous with one another. We should treat one another, regardless of our gender, our sexuality, with humility, with kindness, and as our equal, and not behave predatorily with one another. I understand it's a lonely space. I understand some of the MPs are staying away from their families, their wives and their children. But that does not give them license to behave badly, especially being so awful as to watching porn in the Parliament, or really badly approaching and objectifying women. I am really disgraced by what I've been reading for the last few days. It's been terrible.
I think on that note, we can definitely find some agreement there. Thank you so much, Imam Ajmal Masroor, joining us today from London to talk about our common ground. Now, coming up at midday here on GB News is Alistair Stewart and friends, and I'm delighted to say now that we're joined in the studio by Alistair to look ahead to his own show.
A very good morning.
Very good morning.
Actually, on quite a lot of what Imam was saying there about what really is going on in Parliament and what some of the solutions are. I mean, one of the things I read this morning, very important piece in the Observer from Lindsay Hoyle himself, the Speaker of the House of Commons, saying a Speaker's Conference. I'm not sure that really is the answer. I mean, what I think is needed right now is all of the party leaders, Sir Keir, Boris, Ed, a lot of them, to read the Riot Act to those. And as he pointed out, there are many very good men and women in the House, as well as...
majority, I would say.
I genuinely think that is the case. I really do. And one standout example, Tom Tugendhat, is joining us on the programme, not only to talk a little bit about that, but I really want to talk to him about what we talked on the programme yesterday about, which is why, when 130,000 Brits offer to help people in Ukraine who want to come here to safety, we're still only down in 5 figures of people who've got visas and are coming here. And Tom's a big player in that, and as you well know, chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, so that's also important. But to give what's going on in the Commons and what you as a woman Member of Parliament face, and your colleagues, I'm delighted that we've got on board Eleanor Goodman, who is a very dear friend of mine going way, way back. We worked together at Channel 4 News. Before that, she was at the FT. She is one of the great grown-ups of political commentary. And also at the end of the programme, Barbara Follett, who is a lovely old friend of mine as well. Barbara and her husband Ken were on the programme quite a few months ago, talking about how these two powerful, clever, brilliant people work together. But I first came across Barbara when she was working with many colleagues on what was called Emily's List. And the idea was basically to get more people like you in the House of Commons, more representation. And I was just thinking, when you were having that brilliant conversation with Kevin Maguire and Lord Glassman about the Blair victory, over 100 women got into that Parliament, and immediately the media dubbed them Blair's babes.
Well, then it was
just outstanding condescension, including people like Patricia Hewitt, Mo Mowlam, really big figures who went on. The other thing you talked about so interestingly, the Northern Ireland Agreement, Mo was a top player. Blair babe, fuck. Grow up.
Well, it's still ongoing, Blair babe. Then it was Cameron's cuties all those years later. It's...
I just don't understand why some in our trade, my trade, not your trade, feel the fixation with that. And somebody else tweeted this morning, Gabby Hinchliffe from the Observer, who said, let's not get too carried away about what's alleged to have been going on in the House of Commons as being a Westminster political thing. It's not. These are challenges that many women face across the spectrum of employment. So I'm hoping we can cast a little bit of light on that. And the final thing we're doing, which, were it not for the shenanigans in the House of Commons, might almost have gone unpassed. It was a phenomenal ruling by 2 judges about those people who were moved from hospital into care homes, subsequently contracted COVID and died. 2 brilliant women took the cases of their dads to court and won. Now, the judges said these were unlawful acts. So first of all, I've got a QC on. Unlawful in what sense? Did it break a law, or was it just irresponsible behaviour by the government? And secondly, we've got Nadra, who's a good friend of our programme, who runs the National Care Association, about what she thinks the care homes themselves will do and what other people who lost mums, dads and loved ones as a result of it will do about it. And so I'm hoping that we'll shed some light on it, because I know a lot of people listening will tragically have gone through that rigour.
Quite right. Well, a jam-packed show, as always.
Yeah.
And, of course, we're going to be swapping places, aren't we?
Well, I want to know what you think, as somebody who has only been in Parliament 2 or 3 years. You can rehearse this in your brilliant head, if you like. Has it turned out to be worse than you expected, or did you think it was going to be pretty challenging as well? But you don't have to answer that. But if anyone who wants to really know should Google you and the Daily Express and read that brilliant article that you wrote. No, it's really good, because that was inspired more by the Angela Rayner case than it was Googling tractors and ending up looking at pornography.
Well, very true. So I want to ask you a question about something we've been discussing. This is the 25th anniversary of that historic Blair victory. What are your recollections of that night?
Oh, absolutely vivid, because I was in the studio at ITV News doing the results with Jonathan Dimbleby and I think Mike Brunson, if I remember rightly. And the way we used to do it in those days, to illustrate it, unlike Peter Snow ducking and diving and Jeremy Vine then going on to do it later on, we had what was rather like a arrivals departures board at a railway station. And the first column was kind of 0.5% swing. These are the seats that Labour can expect to get, going right up to 7, 8, 9, 10% that he needed for a really, really big majority. And when the first results started coming in, after about an hour, and it's places like Guildford and Torbay and Sunderland, it was damn clear immediately that there was going to be a lot of activity down at the far end. And it truly was remarkable. I mean, one thing that wasn't mentioned earlier on, although I was really pleased to hear Kevin be so complimentary about John Major, because he too is one of my old friends and a pin-up for what he did on a number of issues, not least saying, stand up and challenge me, stop wittering in the background. But John only just won in 92. A lot of good money was on Neil Kinnock pulling it off, which he didn't. Neil then went, John Smith came and went, sadly, and then Tony, of course, went on to do it. So it was only a small majority that needed turning over, but gracious me, those numbers were phenomenal. The other thing I warned you I wanted to say, and do that to me when I've got to shut up, is it hasn't been mentioned yet, and Glassman knows all about it, that apart from clever people like Ed Bulls working with Gordon Brown, the people who really invented New Labour were John Reid and Charles Clarke and John Newbegin, who went on to work for Lord Putnam, and a little bit later on Mandelson and Campbell. They were the ones who, after Michael Foot's debacle, said, we've got to do something about this, otherwise we're never going to be in power again. And it took them a decade, and those are the standout heroes, because it restored our democracy. People then had a choice again.
And people were really engaged in that election as well, weren't they?
They were, because I think that the big ideas had been voiced by Tony at that phenomenal speech. I think it was Blackpool Party Conference, where he, out of the blue, announced that he was going to abolish Clause 4 of the Labour Party Constitution, which was nationalisation of the commanding heights of the economy, all of the big industries, the banks and the rest of it.
That was a really big step.
That was absolutely huge, because it was at the pounding heart of the philosophy that Maurice Glassman was talking about as well. And the reform of the trade unions had started with people like Francis Pym going way back and in the Thatcher days. But Blair, more importantly than the rights of trade unions within all of our society, wanted to talk about the rights that the unions had to run and control the Labour Party. He changed all of that, and that was absolutely profound.
Well, brilliant recollections there from you, Alistair, as always. And if you want more of this star talent, then join Alistair at 12 o'clock on Alistair Stewart and Friends right here on GB News. Now, Grand Slam champion Boris Becker has been jailed for 2.5 years after a court found he'd been hiding assets and debts worth more than £2.5 million after being declared bankrupt. It's been revealed that the 54-year-old deliberately transferred money to his family and his associates, successfully keeping £390,000 and the proceeds of a bank loan worth £1.1 million from his creditors. Becker was made bankrupt after an expensive divorce and a continued luxury lifestyle. The tennis legend said that brand Becker had been damaged by a series of scandals and negative press, harming his ability to earn money in sponsorship and punditry. He was convicted by a jury of 4 charges under the Insolvency Act and was jailed on Friday, with Judge Deborah Taylor saying Becker had not shown any remorse for what had happened. Well, joining us now to discuss this, I'm delighted to say, is Aidan McGee. So, Aidan, what can you tell us about this story?
Well, it's 20 years in the making, to be honest, Deanna. I mean, you mentioned Judge Deborah Taylor there a few moments ago. She said he'd shown that she understood the humiliation, but wasn't seeing the humility from Boris Becker. Well, she's probably saying that because it's 20 years since he was reprimanded and given a suspended sentence for a tax fraud back in 2002, back in Germany. He didn't heed the lessons. He moved to Switzerland, then he came to the UK. And it's just a series of misdemeanours in his personal life that have cost him money. I mean, the child maintenance fees add up to about £2 million. He didn't know where his Wimbledon trophies were. Now,
Not really, no.
The first of those trophies were highly significant. He was 17 years old. He's the youngest unseeded player to win the men's in the men's draw at Wimbledon as well. Highly prestigious. We all remember Boom Boom Boris. But we've entered an era now where sports memorabilia, as we've seen with Diego Maradona's Hand of God shirt, is worth into the millions of pounds. So he's got 3 of those Wimbledon trophies. What on earth are they worth these days if someone could track them down? He claimed he gave the President's Cup as a gift to his 87-year-old mother some years ago, but he claims to have lost it. Among the items he failed to declare was £101.3 million in a property in Lyman in Germany, in his hometown. There was a £700,000 bank loan, as you mentioned a few moments ago. There were various loans transferred to his ex-wife. He's had 2 divorces as well, and he hasn't really earned serious money. I mean, he was once worth £100 million. 35 million of that was earned during his career. He hasn't played professionally since 1999, and I've known this so many times, Deanna, down the years, where not just celebrities or sports people, but just people who cannot adjust their lifestyle, adapt their spending once the income tap has been turned off. I was with a very famous footballer in 2008, a few years after his peak. He'd earned £50,000 a week at the height of his career. I was in back of a black cab with him going through Knightsbridge, rather, and we were going to do a story in my News of the World days with him about his fall from grace. His income was about £600 a week. He was getting a grocery shop as well, but we had to stop in Knightsbridge while he went into the tobacconist in Harrods to buy a £50 Cuban cigar. So he wasn't able to let go of that lifestyle. This person as well, we tried to even meet in a couple of pubs around Chelsea, but he couldn't go in there because he owed debts of like 12 and 15 and 20 quid. It was absolutely bizarre. We never actually told the story. I can't reveal the guy's name because we never ran the story, and he's since rebuilt his life very successfully since then. But hopefully he's not watching either. But no, it's a familiar tale of woe, and it's people not able to adapt their lifestyle after their peak earning period. And this has been the case with Boris Becker. He's going to serve half his sentence on licence. He might have a tough time in prison in the sense that there's 1,500 inmates at Wandsworth prison, although it is only 2 miles away from his home. His daughter said today it's very unfair that he's gone to prison, but it's difficult to have sympathy with somebody who simply didn't learn the lessons of previous misdemeanours.
Yeah. Well, Paul, I think you've got a question for Aidan.
Yeah, I mean, just the fall from grace it's phenomenal, isn't it, Aidan? I remember watching in 1985 when, as a 17-year-old, he won the Wimbledon Men's Championship. I think from memory, he also won it again the next year, and he was the next best thing in tennis. And you know, he forged a decent media career. He used to pop up on the BBC Wimbledon's coverage, etc. But he's completely self-imploded. But purely on a human level, when you look at the talent the guy had, I mean, it's a tragedy, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, look, you know, even putting aside those 2 early back-to-back Wimbledon title wins, Paul, he won 6 Grand Slams in total. He was very adept at playing across all surfaces. You know, he was, and he was a personality as well. His personality developed. I remember him cutting his hair on court when he was getting in his eyes during a game. He had some quite explosive press conferences as well, and then that drifted into his personality off the court as well. Having said that, do I think there's a route forward for him? Well, he's only 54 years old. He'll be out of prison within probably 15 months, I would have thought. Do the public have the same contempt for this type of crime as they do some others? No, I don't think they do. Somebody on Twitter messaged me earlier with the case with Germany in mind, talking about Uli Hoeneß the former footballer who went to prison over a tax fraud in 2006, but since came back and assumed quite high office within German football. So, and he's the same kind of level of celebrity within Germany. Boris Becker takes his fame, he transcends his national fame. It goes global. Could I see him back in the commentary at Wimbledon, back in the commentary box at Wimbledon in 2 or 3 years' time? I could see him, yeah, I could see it happen.
Brilliant. Well, Aidan, thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in today. You've been watching and listening to The Political Correction. Join us next Sunday at 10 a.m. for 2 hours of discussion, debate and analysis of the week's biggest political stories. But up next, it's the wonderful Alistair Stewart.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking wet across many parts of England and Wales, but drier further north and east. Let's take a look at the details. Starting off in the southwest, and it should be a mostly dry morning, but as rain sweeps in from the north, it will be much wetter and cooler than yesterday. It will also be mostly dry around London first thing. The rain will push southeastwards across the capital through the early part of the afternoon. Meanwhile, in Wales, it's a very wet picture today. The rain will be heaviest this morning, then should ease a little this afternoon. It's also a wet day across the West Midlands. Whilst the rain is not going to be particularly heavy, it is going to last through the morning and into this afternoon. Most of the early rain in the northeast will mostly die out this morning. As a result, it should be drier here than elsewhere, although still largely cloudy with temperatures on the low side. It will also be a mostly dry but largely cloudy lunchtime across Scotland today. Sunshine will be limited and there may be the odd shower around, most likely towards the west. Meanwhile, in Northern Ireland, it's not looking as wet as yesterday, but we still have quite a damp day ahead with plenty of cloud and some outbreaks of rain. The rain will continue to push south-eastwards later with some lingering outbreaks, particularly for England and Wales. And that's how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So